Abraham Lincoln's election basically put everything to a head. The Southerners felt that their way of life and their economic entirety was to be threatened. So in December of 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. And by the time that Abraham Lincoln took office and was inaugurated, several other states had followed suit: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and yes, Texas. And then, of course, later on, you would have other states that followed. But in February of 1861, the southern states that seceded formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America, the CSA. Um, American President James Buchanan had said that no state had a legal right to secede, but that they also had no federal authority to stop it if they did. So, yeah, these states formed their own country. So they sought to seize the United States federal territory that is now within the CSA, most namely Fort Sumter, which is in South Carolina. Fort Sumter, a United States military fort, was in South Carolina, seceded, now part of the CSA. So Confederate militia actually overtook Fort Sumter, and when American troops pushed back, the CSA bombarded Fort Sumter, thereby beginning a conflict, a violent conflict, a civil war, if you will. Okay? So, even though discussions had gone back and forth in the United States government itself that re examined maybe perhaps the idea of a compromise of 1820, Missouri Compromise, that is, to maybe disallow slavery north of that line, but maybe allow it in all places again. Abolitionists feared that, well, you're just going to expand slavery. And while Southerners actually kind of liked that appeal, they still saw the federal government of the United States as being overbearing, and of course, abolitionists were working to end slavery altogether. It wasn't going to work. There wasn't going to be this maybe some sort of compromise this time. So, now what? Let's talk about the opposing sides. The Union had a drastic industrial advantage. Last chapter, I talked about the importance of the Compromise of 1850 and how this little known aspect of American history doesn't get much attention. Yeah, it redrew the boundaries of Texas. Yeah, it had the fugitive slave law and prohibited slavery in new territories. Okay, it kind of placated people's thoughts for the better part of a decade. Sure. The unintended consequence of the Compromise of 1850 was that it allowed the next decade for there to be a dramatic shift in economic growth. The North, the Union, in the decade of the 1850s, saw a massive economic growth in industrialization, transportation, railroads, trains, ships, textiles, communication, port entry, immigration. You had Irish and German immigrants who were coming to the United States in droves, and they were largely going to northern seaport cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. So you have a dramatic population increase, you have a dramatic economic increase, you have a dramatic transportation and manufacturing increase, and an ability to move stuff all throughout the country because of it. The decade of the 1850s was crucially important to the North in the long run because it built a massive economic capacity because of it. So, from that standpoint, the South had largely remained agrarian. The antebellum South maintained its cotton kingdom, and there was very little other industry. So you had cities like Atlanta that were very small in comparison to northern cities. there wasn't much, if any, immigration, you really didn't have much outside of the agricultural output for your economy. You have not diversified. They didn't really need trains. They had a few here and there, but nowhere near what the North had. They didn't have the economic output. They weren't putting out textiles as much, anywhere close, really. The biggest thing that the South relied upon was cotton. So, from a materialistic population and industrial capacity, the South lagged tremendously. They were at a 24-1 material disadvantage. The North has an immense advantage. So, in order for the South to perhaps win this conflict, they would have to resort to other things. Okay, so that compromise of 1850 is crucially important in American history because it allowed the North to further industrialize, populate, and grow otherwise. If the American Civil War had been fought perhaps in the early 1850s, we might very well be living in two different countries right now. I want you to think about that for a second. That's how important the Compromise of 1850 was, because it helped to reestablish the North in growing its economic and material output and population. We could be very well living in two different countries right now. Okay? So, but because of that Compromise of 1850, the North was able to expand in the 1850s and grow from a material standpoint. And Northerners, generally speaking, oftentimes were conflicted. Should we let this secession happen or not? Do we really buy into the cause of abolition or not? Or perhaps maybe, is there something else at play? The Union and Union troops generally fought for the cause of preservation and preserving the Union. They were not necessarily abolitionists. Yes, you had a substantial abolitionist movement that had become very vocal, but Unionists, generally speaking, focused on preserving the Union more so than they did abolishing slavery. The grand democratic experience that is the United States of America is now under direct threat. Just because somebody lost an election and is perceived to have economic threat doesn't mean that states should secede from the Union. That was their take. So, from that standpoint, Northerners fought with the idea that they were going to preserve the Union. Southerners fought for their way of life. They defended the idea of preserving slavery because it preserved their entire economic output in the Southern way. That's how they justified fighting to keep slavery. So, Southerners will often tell you that they fought the War of Northern Aggression, the Civil War, to preserve states' rights. They wanted to preserve states' rights, and they saw the United States federal government as incrementally encroaching upon their states' rights, thereby threatening the Southern way of life. So, for many Southerners, it's a states' right type argument. My question is, states' rights to do what? Because in reality, the South was fighting for the right to maintain the peculiar institution known as slavery. Without slavery and cheap labor, their entire economic output could go by the wayside, thereby threatening the entirety of Southern way of life and existence in the first place. They had to maintain slavery. They had to buy in the idea of black people being inferior. They had to. Whether they believed it or not, they had to make it a truth because their entire economy depended largely upon it. So from that standpoint, it made sense for the South to fight for their right to maintain their way of economic value in their Southern life. So they call it a war against Northern aggression to maintain states' rights. But in reality, it's a war to maintain slavery. Other people might argue that. I just don't see any reality. If it were about something other than slavery, well, it would be more obvious. But the very, very, very obvious aspect that Southerners fought for was to preserve their way of life, which was largely centered around having slavery. Okay? So, Northern soldiers, even though they had a drastic material advantage, they were at a disadvantage earlier on in that they would actually have to go into the South. You are now going to have to take the battle outside of your territory, if you will. So, Northern troops were not largely familiar with the South. They would be fighting in areas that were openly hostile towards Northerners, Yankees, if you will. Okay, folks who, if not were anti-American, they were sympathetic to the Confederate cause, in the very least. And you're also fighting against people who are more familiar with their home territory. So it's like in college football. You have your football team and you're going to go play in your arch rival's home field. It's going to be a hostile environment. Be prepared. There's going to be a lot of shenanigans. Okay? So, from that standpoint, Northern troops were at a disadvantage. They also had a disadvantage because Southern troops, even though they were highly disorganized, typically grew up in cultures that were more familiar with an outdoorsy type way of living. You have more rural communities who are more accustomed to perhaps hunting, shooting your food, and you're going to shoot your deer and kill it, you're going to go eat it. So you more readily had Southerners who are more familiar with marksmanship and rifles and other firearms. And because of it, it was easier to perhaps lead and train them because you didn't have to spend so much time training them about the proper aspects of marksmanship. So, from that standpoint, yeah, there was an advantage for Southerners. Also, in and of which, a lot of times you had Confederate troops who had ragtag uniforms. Eventually, they would adopt a gray uniform style, but they both had meager existence with meals. You had salted foods, you had salted pork, coffee, the equivalent of crackers to this day. You didn't really have a whole lot to eat, so things would become treacherous. Um, as far as support itself, the South, which had manufactured cotton and sold quite a bit of it to textile mills in England and in France, perhaps sought out partnerships with those two countries so as to maybe have an intervention. Maybe France and Britain can come to the Confederates' cause. Um, Early on in the conflict, many Europeans, they thought the Confederates would win, or at least they favored the Confederates. Some of it may have been built around old resentment of American revolutionary ideals. Otherwise, though, they saw value in the South in one form or another. But point be made is that Confederates had their cause for what they believed in. Northerners, Yankees, if you will, had their cause that they believed in preservation of the Union. So, the next 4 years in American history are going to include the bloodiest war in America.